This video is going to go over the 10 most hated changes in Siege history. Now, we all know that Rainbow Six Siege has had its fair share of controversial operator releases, nerfs, buffs, and overall just alterations over the years, and I won't lie, there are way more than 10, so if I miss any important ones, please comment down below, and make sure you stick around until the end for the most diabolical change in Siege's history you probably don't even know about. Let's get started with our first point of the video, which is Blackbeard at his launch and Operation Dust line. A lot of my viewers are more recent Siege players, and so you guys probably don't even know that Blackbeard literally broke Rainbow Six Siege when he was first released. And this dude was not just insane, he was unkillable in every sense of the word. His shields might as well have just been indestructible. You could have chucked a whole C4 in his face and he would have walked away unscathed. It was absolutely ridiculous. And if all 5 defenders opened fire on his shield at the same time and landed every single shot, they would literally have to empty their entire magazines before it maybe got even close to breaking. And not to mention that his primary with 2-shot, 3-speed defenders too, just overall so good. And when Blackbeard was released in May of 2016, the community was absolutely victimized in game by this American operator, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. I figured this was a good spot to start off with considering the new Blackbeard rework, and if you think Blackbeard is good now with his rework, you don't even know what a good version of Blackbeard is. So, but if you were around for the original overpowered Blackbeard, you probably are getting PTSD from this, so we'll go ahead and move on to number 2, which is probably the most widely hated change on this entire list, Ranked 2.0. Now, I could quite literally talk about how rightfully hated Ranked 2.0's announcement and launch was for hours. That could be multiple videos in itself, and I mean, I actually do have so many videos talking about it, but chances are, even if you're a newer player, that you also hate Ranked 2.0. Back in the day, nothing could beat hopping on a new season and playing your 10 placements with your friends and hoping you would get placed somewhere good. Now, everyone starts from the same point and has to grind and grind and grind until Siege stops giving you any RP and thinks you've maxed out your rank to the point you're hard stuck for the remainder of the season. Speaking from personal experience, it's not a skill issue, I promise. But Ranked 1.0 certainly had its problems, don't get me wrong, and it was in need of some tweaks, but the point of this video is to highlight some of the most destructive changes in Siege history, and Ranked 2.0 was truly exactly that. There aren't many things that people are more passionate about when arguing Siege problems than this exact change. I honestly think the Ranked 2.0 announcement a couple of years ago marked the shift into this new era of Siege that has been the topic of discussion for so long now. Another massive marker of this new era of Siege is the addition of the 1.5 timescope, which is the third change on this list. The 1.5 timescope era was one of the most destructive times in Siege's nearly 10-year history, and when I say destructive, I mean that with every sense of the word. It got released at the end of year 5 or beginning of year 6 around that time, and it was removed earlier this year, but the 1.5 timescope in its time that it was in the game created an entire meta that was one of the most toxic times in Siege history, and really trickled down into creating the most recent ACOG meta and the overall TDM meta, so it's safe to say that the impact of one singular weapon attachment was quite massive. You had all your Warden Warriors who would feast with the 1.5, and I remember Oryx was another big one at the time. It was just an overall really toxic time period where people began choosing operators based on their weapon attachments, which again would eventually create an entire generation of players that would go on to spamming the ACOG meta too with operators like Melusi and Doc, and this is a time that I definitely do not miss at all because man, was it weird, but probably not as weird as this next change. Grenades have always been a constant in Siege. Not much, if anything, has changed with them aside from moving around different operators' loadouts. No one was expecting or wanting any changes for them. And then Operation Deep Freeze rolls around and Ubisoft decides to make frag grenades almost completely useless. You can no longer cook frag grenades, which eliminates an entire layer of the game when playing with frag operators. It also just doesn't really make sense in a realistic tactical shooter game that you can't use frag grenades as they are actually intended or used just to adhere to a random game update. It's definitely one of the more irrelevant changes on this list, like not one of the most impactful changes, but it is probably the weirdest and most random change on this entire list, and people were absolutely pissed about it when it first came out. But this next change definitely takes the cake in terms of making people mildly infuriated. In Operation New Blood, Recruit was remastered into Striker and Sentry, and although it was definitely the best change for the game, it sparked a lot of anger within the community, especially players that have been around for a long time. And you know, in the first few years of Siege, it was always fun to 5-stack, Recruit Rush with friends, and Recruit kind of became a nostalgic, unproblematic operator for a lot of people, and a lot of players were sad to see Recruit go, especially considering Striker and Sentry didn't necessarily strike people as exciting in any way, so it felt like Recruit was really being sacrificed for nothing. Not only that, but this Recruit rework was really the only new content we got in the entire new season of Operation New Blood, so it was just such a dry time period for Siege, and definitely one of the most bleak seasons for content and just all around fun in Siege. And I know that I hardly touched the game because it just felt like an extension of the season before it, and I was just bored of it. So this change kind of takes place in a larger vacuum here. Obviously, with Striker and Sentry being added to the game and Recruit being taken out and no other content being added to the game, it just left the community very upset, and it was definitely one of the most frustrating seasons from a player perspective overall. The next change was hated on by so many people, but it was totally needed looking back on it, and it's when Ubisoft made cameras lose signal when being outside. This was introduced in Operation High Caliber and was not well received by most of the community. In case you don't already know, Ubisoft makes a lot of changes in Siege based on Pro League to accommodate the pro player base, and this is one of those changes that Ubisoft saw from Pro League. Pros would abuse this ability to throw specifically Valkyrie cams outside, and this led to her having an over 70% ban rate in ranked and an absolutely ridiculous pick rate and win delta. So that's a clear indication that Siege players absolutely adored Valkyrie, and rightfully so, because she was one of the best operators in the game. And in the designer notes for High Caliber, Ubisoft literally described Valkyrie as oppressive since she had too much power, which is just hilarious in context for anything to be described as oppressive, but it really shows how strong she was because of these outside cams. And it definitely took a long time for the player base to adjust to this big change, impacting one of the most played operators in the entire game. Speaking of, this next change impacted some of the least played operators in the game and turned them into their own meta. This would of course be the absolutely overpowered shield rework that was introduced in the beginning of this current year. Shield operators definitely needed some kind of a buff because they were way underpicked and had very low win deltas, but no one knew that this revamped shield mechanic would turn into its own meta that would persist for 2 whole seasons. It was nearly impossible to stop a shield that half knew what they were doing because they became so easy to use. And it's funny talking about this in the past tense right now because it was literally just a few weeks ago now, and I still forget that they nerfed shields, but this is 100% one of the most insane metas that this game has ever had, and I'm so thankful that they have finally, fixed it. I saw probably hundreds of Twitter and Reddit posts about people quitting just because of this shield mechanic, and even some content creators and personal friends that I know. Ubisoft somehow found a way to turn shield operators from completely niche to fragging beasts with just one update. This next change is tiny, literally. Do you remember bullet holes in this game? There was a short time period when you could shoot one bullet through a soft wall and see fully through to the other side, with anyone looking at it from further than a foot away wouldn't be able to see at all. A lot of people loved this because although it was unfair, it's technically realistic. There was a lot of outrage when this got taken out of the game a couple of years ago from the hyper-realism side of the Siege fanbase, but there's no debate that this was a needed change. I mean, I know I started this change by saying it was tiny, but this was an entire, layer of the game, like its own strategy. I remember YouTubers having entire bullet hole guides and, best bullet hole spots on every ranked map videos because it was so powerful, it was that important. But this is definitely one of those changes that most people forget even happened. And speaking of, there's a good chance you don't even know about this next to last change. At Rainbow Six Siege's conception, the game mechanics had a very particular and unique way of working, with movement and gunfights having this very distinct feel to it, and unless you played it, you really just don't know at all what I'm talking about. But to be more specific, there was this thing known as the classic Siege recoil. It was a bit sporadic and even took into account that no gun fires the same way and would have random recoil patterns thrown in there every once in a while. I'm showing the clips on screen to show what I mean because, like I said earlier, a lot of my viewers are much more recent players and they probably never even knew about the old Siege recoil, but if you were around, you definitely know what I'm talking about and you haven't forgotten about it. To be honest, the old Siege recoil was much worse in every single way. They changed it so that it would be more predictable and more user-friendly, and people miss it and they still reminisce about the old game's recoil just because it represented a nostalgic time for them when this game was in its very early and basic stages, and some even would say that it was the prime of Siege. But the game's recoil was completely revamped and it changed the entire feel for the game, which was definitely the right move in the long run, but you could imagine just how immense a change of this magnitude was for the time, you know? Like imagine if Ubisoft decided to entirely rework the game's recoil and mechanics like tomorrow. You know, they pushed out a whole new update, entirely changing it so everyone was kind of on the same level, starting up with this new recoil. So you could just, you know, picture it in your head how ridiculous that was at the time, but it definitely worked out in the long run. Now, this last change is no doubt the most pivotal change, or rather time period, of Rainbow Six Siege. At the beginning of the video, I said most people don't know about it, and that's because there were only 24,000 average players at the time of this change, yet it entirely changed the landscape of Siege as we know it. And that, my friends, would be Operation Health. Even I was hardly around for this operation as I first started playing in the last few weeks of the season, but if you don't know, Operation Health was essentially a trial and error testing ground for Rainbow Six Siege for nearly the entire season, where constant updates and patches were pushed out to attempt to fix a magnitude of problems with the early stages of the game, such as unreliable servers, hit registration, matchmaking, and too many bugs to list just in this video. But Operation Health quickly became a meme in the Siege community because players were upset with Ubisoft. From the surface, it seemed like Ubisoft had a broken game with nothing being fixed, and the community was outraged, and it really was a time of uncertainty for the future of the game. In reality, the operation was intended to fix a load of back-end problems to allow for the game to be successful in the future, so Ubisoft sacrificed short-term success for long-term success. And without Operation Health, Rainbow Six Siege may have never made it out of the year of 2017, and it wouldn't have become as big as the game did. Could you imagine if the next season of Siege was literally just a testing ground? Like, imagine how mad the player base would be. I talked about earlier with Operation New Blood and how mad the player base was getting like no new operators, just kind of reworked operators. Imagine Siege spent the whole next season literally just fixing bugs. It would be insane. It definitely would be good for the game, but like they'd probably lose their whole player base, but that's neither here nor there. This video visited a lot of different eras of Siege, so let me know when you first started playing and what you think the most destructive change in the game's history is. And if you like this video, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other videos. Besides for that, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.